In the year 1213 BC, on the banks of the Nile, embalmers prepared the body of the most powerful man their world had ever known, Ramesses the Great, pharaoh of pharaohs, conqueror, builder, God on earth. They wrapped him in linen, they packed his organs in jars, and then they did something that, 3,000 years later, would leave archaeologists genuinely stunned. They took small black berries and pushed them carefully into the nostrils of the dead king. When Victorian Egyptologists finally unwrapped that mummy, there they were, perfectly preserved. Peppercorns, berries from a vine that did not grow anywhere within 4,000 kilometers of Egypt, a vine that grew only on one humid coastline, on the far side of the world. Stop and think about what that means for a moment. For someone to place pepper inside the corpse of the most important person in Egypt, that pepper had to travel thousands of kilometers, across deserts and oceans, through dozens of hands, more than 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. This was not seasoning. This was treasure fit for a god. And the strange, almost unbelievable truth is that this same little berry, the one sitting in the grinder on your kitchen table right now, would go on to drain the gold out of the Roman Empire, ransom a city, launch the ships that discovered half the planet, and build the first multinational corporations in human history. The journey of pepper, from a wild vine in an Indian forest to the most ordinary thing in your cupboard, is one of the strangest and bloodiest stories in the history of the world. And to understand it, you have to go back to where it all began. A coastline in southern India. It is called the Malabar Coast. Today it is the Indian state of Kerala, a green strip of land pressed between the Arabian Sea and a mountain range called the Western Ghats. And in those mountains, climbing wild up the trunks of trees, grew a flowering vine, Piper nigrum, black pepper. The vine produces small round fruits called drupes that ripen from green to red. Picked unripe and dried in the sun, they shrivel and blacken into the wrinkled little spheres we call peppercorns. Indian farmers had been cultivating this vine for an astonishingly long time. The use of pepper in Indian cooking goes back at least 4,000 years, to around 2000 BC. Dravidian farmers learned to train the vines up rough-barked trees, planted at careful intervals, a method Kerala's farmers still use today. To them, it was food, and it was medicine, written into the ancient healing system of Ayurveda. But here is what made pepper different from almost every other plant on Earth. It only grew there. For most of human history, no one in Europe, no one in Egypt, no one in China had any idea where pepper actually came from. They only knew that it arrived, carried by merchants who guarded the secret of its source like their lives depended on it. Because it did. As long as nobody else knew where the pepper grew, the people who controlled the root controlled a fortune. And the first people to truly lose their minds over it were the Romans. By the time of the early Roman Empire, after Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, the secret was partly out. Roman ships had learned to ride the monsoon winds straight across the Arabian Sea to the Malabar coast. As many as 120 ships a year made the journey. They sailed to a port in Kerala called Muziris, a name that appears again and again in ancient records as the Great Pepper Emporium of the East. There, Roman gold coins were poured out and exchanged for sacks of dried black berries. And Rome could not get enough. Pepper appeared in everything. We still have a Roman cookbook, attributed to a gourmet named Apicius, and the numbers are almost comical. Of its 468 recipes, 349 call for pepper. Wine sauces, roasted meats, fish, even sweet desserts. The Romans put pepper in nearly everything they ate. But all of that pepper had to be paid for, in gold, flowing out of the empire and into India, and never coming back. And one Roman noticed. His name was Pliny the Elder, the great writer and naturalist, and he was furious about it. He complained that there was no year in which India did not drain the Roman Empire of 50 million sesterces, a staggering sum. He called it the price of luxury and decadence, money simply vanishing from Rome in exchange for things that, in his words, were burned up or eaten. What outraged Pliny most was that pepper had no real use. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't beautiful, it just bit the tongue. And yet Romans would empty the treasury for it. Pliny was watching, in real time, the world's first trade deficit driven by pure craving. And pepper's hold on the Roman imagination ran so deep that it survived even the fall of Rome itself. This is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. In the year 408, the city of Rome, the eternal city, the heart of the ancient world, was surrounded. At its gates stood Alaric, king of the Visigoths, and his army. The Romans, desperate, sent envoys to negotiate. What would the barbarian king accept to spare the city? Alaric named his price. He demanded gold. He demanded silver. He demanded thousands of silk tunics and scarlet-dyed skins, and he demanded 3,000 pounds of pepper. Think about that. A conquering warlord, with the most powerful city on earth at his mercy, put pepper on the same list as gold and silver. That is how valuable these little berries had become. Pepper was not a flavor, it was a form of wealth you could hold in your hand. And that idea, pepper as money, did not die with Rome. It defined the entire Middle Ages. For centuries across Europe, pepper was so precious it was literally used as currency. People paid rent in pepper. They paid taxes in pepper. They settled debts and dowries in peppercorns. It was called black gold, and the legacy of that survives even now in our own language. There is still a legal term, peppercorn rent, meaning a tiny token payment, a single peppercorn handed over to seal a deal. The phrase outlived the practice by 700 years. Now, you have probably heard one famous story about medieval pepper, that people used it to cover up the taste of rotten meat. It's in textbooks, it's everywhere. And here is the part that surprises most people. It is almost certainly a myth. Historians, like Yale's Paul Friedman, have pointed out the obvious flaw. Pepper was wildly expensive, a luxury only the rich could afford. And anyone rich enough to buy pepper was rich enough to buy fresh meat. You did not spend a fortune on spice to disguise food you could simply have thrown away. The truth is less dramatic but more revealing. Medieval Europe's elite craved pepper for the same reason the Romans did, because it was a symbol. To serve heavily peppered food was to announce, to everyone at your table, that you were rich enough to eat the spice of kings. But Europe was not the only civilization that fell under pepper's spell. Far to the east, China developed its own deep hunger for the spice. Pepper may have been known there as early as the 2nd century BC, and by the 12th century it had become a luxury craved by the Chinese wealthy. When the great Venetian traveler Marco Polo passed through the city of Hangzhou in the 13th century, he was astonished by how much pepper its people consumed every single day. And in the early 15th century, when China launched its legendary treasure fleets, enormous ships under the Admiral Zheng He that sailed as far as Africa, they came home loaded with pepper in such vast quantities that the once precious spice finally spread to ordinary Chinese tables. Across the entire span of Asia and Europe, the same pattern repeated. Wherever pepper arrived, people decided they could not live without it. But all that pepper, flowing into Europe, came with a problem. Europeans had no idea where it came from, and they didn't control a single step of the journey. And whoever did control that journey was about to become unimaginably rich. For centuries, the pepper road ran like this. From the Malabar coast, Arab and Persian merchants carried it across the Indian Ocean and up through the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. From there it crossed the Middle East by caravan. And finally it reached the Mediterranean, where two Italian cities, Venice and Genoa, took control. From the 11th to the 15th centuries, Venice and Genoa held a near total monopoly on the spice trade into Europe. Every sack of pepper passed through their warehouses, and they marked up the price at every step. By the time a peppercorn reached a kitchen in Paris or London, its price had multiplied many times over, with a cut taken by Arab traders, Egyptian middlemen, and Venetian merchants along the way. And the rest of Europe was sick of paying it. Sick of being at the end of a very long, very expensive chain, with Venice and the Arab world holding all the power. There had to be another way. A way to cut out every middleman. A way to sail directly to the source, wherever it was, and buy pepper straight from the people who grew it. Pay attention to this next part, because the search for that route is about to redraw the map of the entire world. In 1498, after rounding the southern tip of Africa, the perilous Cape of Good Hope, a small, battered Portuguese fleet reached the Malabar coast of India. At its head was a hard, ambitious captain named Vasco da Gama. His crew was half dead from scurvy and starvation, and when he stepped ashore at the bustling spice port of Calicut, he had finally done it. He had found a sea route from Europe to the source of the pepper. For the first time in history, a European could buy pepper directly from India, with no Venetians and no Arab middlemen taking their cut. The reception in Calicut was cold. The Indian rulers were unimpressed by da Gama's cheap gifts of cloth and glass beads. They had been trading with rich Arab merchants for centuries, and these ragged newcomers had little to offer. Da Gama left with only a modest cargo. But it didn't matter, because the real sensation was what happened when those ships limped back into Lisbon. That cargo of pepper and spices sold for an enormous profit, many times the cost of the entire expedition. The message was electric. There was a direct route to the east, and it led to wealth beyond imagination. And here is the detail that changed everything. Da Gama had brought more than sailors to Calicut. His ships carried cannon. They were floating fortresses. And the Portuguese quickly realized that they could not outtrade the established Arab and Indian merchants, so they decided to outgun them instead. From the very start, the European pepper trade was built on a foundation of violence. The Portuguese seized ports, built forts, and forced local rulers to trade on their terms. They attacked and burned the ships of rival traders. Within a few decades, the profits from the Portuguese spice trade were said to run many times the entire annual budget of the Portuguese crown. A small kingdom on the western edge of Europe had become a global superpower, and it had done it on the back of a berry. This was the true beginning of globalization. Not in the 20th century, but on the day a starving captain stepped ashore at Calicut and returned home with a sack of pepper. But Portugal's grip would not last, because everyone had now seen how much money there was in pepper, and a far more ruthless competitor was coming. And these newcomers would not just trade in pepper. They would invent an entirely new kind of organization to do it. In 1602, the Dutch founded the Dutch East India Company, in their own language, the VOC. And this was something the world had never seen before. It was not just a trading company. It was the first true joint stock corporation in history. Thousands of ordinary investors could buy shares, pooling their money and sharing the risk and the profit. With that flood of capital, the VOC could do what no single merchant ever could. It built its own fleets. It raised its own armies. It waged its own wars. A private company with the power of a nation, created to control the spice trade. And here is the uncomfortable reality that sits at the heart of this story. The thing we now sprinkle on our eggs without a second thought helped finance one of the most brutal chapters in human history. To enforce their monopoly, the Dutch and the Portuguese ruled the spice lands through terror. The most notorious example came in the nearby Spice Islands, where in 1621 the VOC, under a governor named Jan Pieterzoon Koen, killed or deported almost the entire population of the Banda Islands, around 15,000 people, to seize control of the spice that grew there, replacing them with enslaved laborers on company plantations. The same logic of conquest drove the pepper trade. The Dutch took the rich pepper ports of the Malabar coast by force from the Portuguese. Trading networks that had run for 1,000 years on negotiation and trust were replaced, almost overnight, by fortresses, monopolies, and cannon. Pepper, and the spices that traveled with it, were not a sideshow to the age of European colonialism. They were one of its engines. The desire to control these little berries pulled European empires across the oceans, justified the conquest of foreign lands, and helped build the systems of forced labor and slavery that would scar the world for centuries. The next time someone tells you it was just a spice, remember that. People killed for this. People died for this. Empires rose and fell for this. So how did black gold become so cheap that today it sits in a shaker on every restaurant table, free for the taking? The answer is, slowly, the secret got out. The vine was just a plant, and plants can be grown in new places. Over the following centuries, pepper cultivation spread beyond India to Southeast Asia, to Indonesia, to Malaysia, and eventually far beyond. As more and more land was planted, the supply exploded, and as the supply grew, the price collapsed. The thing that had once ransomed Rome and bankrupted emperors became, for the first time in history, something an ordinary family could afford. By the modern era, pepper had completed one of the most dramatic falls from grace of any commodity on earth, from the spice of kings to a kitchen staple worth a few cents. But the story of pepper is not a story about the past. It is happening right now. And it has a twist that, if you're watching this from Vietnam, you already know. Because today, the undisputed king of the pepper world is not India. It is not Indonesia. It is Vietnam. It is one of the most remarkable agricultural stories of the modern age. Vietnam barely grew pepper for export until the 1990s. And then, in the space of a single generation, it became the dominant force on the planet. Today, Vietnam produces roughly 40% of the world's pepper harvest and accounts for around 60% of all global pepper exports, more than every other country on Earth combined. The volcanic red soil of the Central Highlands, in provinces like Dak Lak and Gia Lai, turned out to be near perfect for the vine. Hundreds of thousands of small family farms, many of them growing pepper alongside coffee, quietly took over a trade that emperors and corporations had once fought wars to control. And in recent years, the value of that crop has soared. In 2024, Vietnam's pepper exports brought in a record of around $1.33 billion, as prices climbed to their highest levels in nearly a decade. The biggest buyer of all that pepper is the United States. The empire that once paid Rome's old role of insatiable customer is now America, and the gold flows east to the farmers of Vietnam. So the journey comes full circle. A vine that began as a closely guarded secret on the Malabar coast of India is now, 2,000 years later, dominated by the farmers of Vietnam, feeding a global pepper trade worth billions of dollars a year. The spice that drained Rome of gold now flows back the other way. But even now, pepper's future is not guaranteed. And here is the threat that hangs over it. That same Central Highlands soil that made Vietnam a superpower is now under pressure. Climate change is bringing unpredictable droughts and erratic weather to the key growing regions, threatening the harvest. The pepper vine is also vulnerable to disease, especially a root rot that can wipe out an entire farm. And there is a quieter danger too. Many farmers, chasing higher and more stable profits, have been pulling up their pepper vines and replacing them with other crops, like coffee and durian. After years of low prices, a generation of growers simply walked away. That's part of why prices have spiked so sharply, because the world's supply of pepper is tighter and more fragile than most people realize. The king of spices, which survived the fall of Rome and the rise and collapse of empires, now faces a far quieter set of enemies: a changing climate, a hungry fungus, and the simple economics of a farmer deciding what's worth planting. So think about the full arc of this story for a moment. A wild vine, climbing a tree in an Indian forest. berries pushed into the nose of a dead pharaoh, gold draining out of Rome year after year to feed a craving for spice, a barbarian king demanding pepper to spare a city, a legal term, peppercorn rent, that we still use today, a starving captain stepping ashore in Calicut and, without knowing it, beginning the age of globalization. The first corporation in history, armed with its own navy, built to corner the market on a berry. Conquest, slavery, and empire, all chasing the same small dried fruit. And finally, the long fall, from the most precious substance on earth to the cheapest, most ordinary thing in your kitchen. This is the story of what happens when human beings discover something they decide they cannot live without. We will sail off the edge of the known world for it. We will build empires and burn cities for it. And then, once we finally have enough of it, we forget entirely how precious it ever was. So the next time you reach for the pepper grinder and give it that absent-minded twist over your plate, pause for just a second. You are holding something that kings were buried with, that emperors bankrupted themselves for, that redrew the map of the world. The most ordinary spice on your table has one of the most extraordinary histories of anything humans have ever traded. If you made it this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next deep dive into the hidden history behind everyday things. And drop a comment and tell me, which part of Pepper's story surprised you the most? The pharaoh's mummy? The ransom of Rome? Or the fact that the king of spices today is grown in Vietnam? Let me know down below, and I'll see you in the next one.